Hello, everyone. How are we doing today? I'm coming at you very early today, like the earliest that I think I will ever do one of these. It's about 3 in the afternoon. It is Thursday, and it is Shakespeare's birthday. So I have a bunch of Shakespeare-themed plans for the evening. So this is literally the only time that I had in the day that I was able to get this in. So I'm very glad I was able to do so. I don't know how many of you will be joining me live at this point, but if you join me after the fact, that's fine too. I mean, we're coming toward the end of Dune, so I really didn't want to, skip a day because we are getting so very close to finishing this book. So the next two chapters are fairly short compared to what we've had so far. So I'm taking those in a chunk together. Also, because, like I mentioned yesterday, the last chapter of the book is somewhere in the neighborhood of 25, 30 pages. And I'm going to be going with that all in one go. So, yeah, I kind of wanted to get this in today. But if all goes as planned, tomorrow I will be finishing the book, which means we're going to be looking at what is going to be next that I read. And I've already mentioned yesterday what it was that I want to read next, and I have three selections. It's either going to be Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, or Stardust by Neil Gaiman. And there is a favorable vote in favor of Stardust being next, which, as I said yesterday, I would be more than happy to read any of those. So if there are any preferences by anyone who's watching this video live or after the fact, then that will be how we go with it. As I said, I don't care what I read next, aside from those three selections. I really want to read one of those. So let's hop right into to Dune. And yesterday, what happened was Paul made a huge speech assisted by the power of the voice, and he successfully converted each of the Fremen to his cause. I mean, they were already down, but he convinced them that he did not have to kill Stilgar in order to make that happen. So he's basically got an entire army on his side at this point. And then we have Gurney Halleck, who attempted to kill Jessica because he thought that she was the traitor, and it turned out that such was not the fact. So Gurney has stopped that. And then Paul took and converted the water of life in an effort to increase his prescient vision for them going into this final thing, which put him in a coma for 3 weeks until Cheney and Jessica revived him from it. So that's where we are right now. They are preparing for their final offensive into Harkonnen territory, and we're hopping right in. All right, here we go. And that day dawned when Arrakis lay at the hub of the universe, with the wheel poised to spin. From Arrakis Awakening by the Princess Irulan. "Will you look at that thing?" Stilgar whispered. Paul lay beside him in a slit of rock high on the shield wall rim, eye fixed to the collector of a Fremen telescope. The oil lens was focused on a starship lighter exposed by dawn in the basin below them. The tall eastern face of the ship glistened in the flat light of the sun, but the shadow side still showed yellow portholes from glow globes of the night. Beyond the ship, the city of Arrakeen lay cold and gleaming in the light of the northern sun. It wasn't the lighter that excited Stilgar's awe, Paul knew, but the construction for which the lighter was only the center post. A single metal hutment, many stories tall, reached out in a 1,000-meter circle from the base of the lighter, a tent composed of interlocking metal leaves, the temporary lodging place for 5 legions of Sardaukar, and His Imperial Majesty the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV. From his position squatting at Paul's left, Gurney Halleck said, "I count 9 levels to it. Must be quite a few Sardaukar in there." "5 legions," Paul said. "It grows light," Stilgar hissed. "We like it not, you exposing yourself, Muad'Dib. Let us go back into the rocks now." I'm perfectly safe here, Paul said. That ship mounts projectile weapons, Gurney said. They believe us protected by shields, Paul said. They wouldn't waste a shot on an unidentified trio even if they saw us. Paul swung the telescope to scan the far wall of the basin, seeing the pockmarked cliffs, the slides that marked the tombs of so many of his father's troopers. And he had a momentary sense of the fitness of things, that the shades of those men should look down on this moment. The Harkonnen forts and towns across the shielded lands lay in Fremen hands, or cut away from their source like stalks severed from a plant and left to wither. Only this basin and its city remained to the enemy. They might try a sortie by Thopter, Stilgar said, if they see us. Let them, Paul said. We've Thopters to burn today, and we know a storm is coming. He swung the telescope to the far side of the Arakeen landing field now, to the Harkonnen frigates lined up there with a Chom Company banner waving gently from its staff on the ground beneath them. And he thought of the desperation that had forced the Guild to permit these two groups to land, while all the others were held in reserve. The Guild was like a man testing the sand with his toe to gauge its temperature before erecting a tent. Is there anything new to see from here? Gurney asked. We should be getting under cover. The storm is coming. Paul returned his attention on the giant hutment. They've even brought their women, he said, and lackeys and servants. Ah, my dear Emperor, how confident you are. Men are coming up the secret way, Stilgar said. It may be your theme and Korva returning. All right, Still, Paul said. We'll go back. But he took one final look around through the telescope, studying the plain with its tall ships, the gleaming metal hutment, the silent city, the frigates of the Harkonnen mercenaries. Then he slid backward around a scarp of rock. His place at the telescope was taken by a Fedaykin guardsman. Paul emerged into a shallow depression at the shield wall's surface. It was a place about 30 meters in diameter and some 3 meters deep, a natural feature of the rock that the Fremen had hidden beneath a translucent camouflage cover. Communications equipment was clustered around a hole in the wall to the right. Fedaykin guards deployed through the depression waited for Muad'Dib's command to attack. 2 men emerged from the hole by the communications equipment, spoke to the guards there. Paul glanced at Stilgar, nodded in the direction of the 2 men. Get the report, Still. Stilgar moved to obey. Paul crouched with his back to the rock, stretching his muscles, straightened. He saw Stilgar sending the 2 men back into that dark hole in the rock, thought about the long climb down that narrow man-made tunnel to the floor of the basin. Stilgar crossed to Paul. What was so important that they couldn't send a Cielago with the message? Paul asked. They're saving their birds for the battle, Stilgar said. He glanced at the communications equipment, back to Paul. Even with a tight beam, it is wrong to use those things, Muad'Dib. They can find you by taking a bearing on its emission. They'll soon be too busy to find me, Paul said. What did the men report? Our pet Sardaukar have been released near Old Gap, low on the rim, and are on their way to their master. The rocket launchers and other projectile weapons are in place. The people you deployed, as you ordered. It was all routine. Paul glanced across the shallow bowl, studying his men in the filtered light admitted by the camouflage cover. He felt time creeping like an insect working its way across an exposed rock. It'll take our Sardaukar a little time afoot before they can signal a troop carrier, Paul said. They are being watched? They are being watched, Stilgar said. Beside Paul, Gurney Halleck cleared his throat. Hadn't we best be getting to a place of safety? There is no such place, Paul said. Is the weather report still favorable? A great-grandmother of a storm coming, Stilgar said. Can you not feel it, Muad'Dib? The air does feel chancy, Paul agreed, but I like the certainty of polling the weather. The storm will be here in the hour, Stilgar said. He nodded toward the gap that looked out over the Emperor's hutment and the Harkonnen frigates. They know it there, too. Not a Thopter in the sky. Everything pulled in and tied down. They've had a report on the weather from their friends in space. Any more probing sorties? Paul asked. Nothing since the landing last night, Stilgar said. They know we're here. I think now they wait to choose their own time. We choose the time, Paul said. Gurney glanced upward, growled, If they let us. That fleet'll stay in space, Paul said. Gurney shook his head. They have no choice, Paul said. We can destroy the spice. The guild dares not risk that. Desperate people are the most dangerous, Gurney said. Are we not desperate? Stilgar asked. Gurney scowled at him. You haven't lived with the Fremen dream, Paul cautioned. Still is thinking of all the water we've spent on bribes, the years of waiting we've added before Arrakis can bloom. He's not... Gurney scowled. Why is he so gloomy? Stilgar asked. He's always gloomy before a battle, Paul said. It's the only form of good humor Gurney allows himself. A slow, wolfish grin spread across Gurney's face, the teeth showing white above the chip cut of his stillsuit. It glooms me much to think on all the poor Harkonnen souls we'll dispatch unshriven, he said. Stilgar chuckled. You talks like a featherkeen. Gurney was born a death commando, Paul said. And he thought, yes, let them occupy their minds with small talk before we test ourselves against that force on the plain. He turned to the gap in the rock wall and back to Gurney, found that the troubadour warrior had resumed a brooding scowl. Worry saps the strength, Paul murmured. You told me that once, Gurney. My duke, Gurney said. My chief worry is the atomics. If you use them to blast a hole in the shield wall... Those people up there won't use atomics against us, Paul said. They don't dare. For the same reason they cannot risk our destroying the source of the spice. But the injunction against the injunction, Paul barked. It's fear, not the injunction, that keeps the houses from hurling atomics against each other. The language of the Great Convention is clear enough. Use of atomics against humans shall be a cause for planetary obliteration. We're going to blast the shield wall, not humans. It's too fine a point, Gurney said. The hair splitters up there will welcome any point, Paul said. Let's talk no more about it. He turned away, wishing he actually felt that confident. Presently, he said, What about the city people? Are they in position yet? Yes, Stilgar muttered. Paul looked at him. What's eating you? I never knew the city man could be trusted completely, Stilgar said. I was a city man myself once, Paul said. Stilgar stiffened. His face grew dark with blood. Muad'Dib knows, I did not mean... I know what you meant, Still. But the test of a man isn't what you think he'll do. It's what he actually does. These city people have Fremen blood. It's just that they haven't yet learned how to escape their bondage. We'll teach them. Stilgar nodded, spoke in a rueful tone. The habits of a lifetime, Muad'Dib. On the funeral plain, we learn to despise the men of the communities. Paul glanced at Gurney, saw him studying Stilgar. Tell us, Gurney, why were the city folk down there driven from their homes by the Sardaukar? An old trick, my duke. They thought to burden us with refugees. It's been so long since guerrillas were effective that the mighty have forgotten how to fight them, Paul said. The Sardaukar have played into our hands. They grabbed some city women for their sport, decorated their battle standards with the heads of the men who objected. And they've built up a fever of hate among people who otherwise would have looked on the coming battle as no more than a great inconvenience, and the possibility of exchanging one set of masters for another. The Sardaukar recruit for us, Stilgar. The city people do seem eager, Stilgar said. Their hate is fresh and clear, Paul said. That's why they use them as shock troops. The slaughter among them will be fearful, Gurney said. Stilgar nodded agreement. They were told the odds, Paul said. They know every Sardaukar they kill will be one less for us. You see, gentlemen, they have something to die for. They've discovered they're a people. They're awakening. A muttered exclamation came from the watcher at the telescope. Paul moved to the rock slit, asked, What is it out there? A great commotion, Muad'Dib, the watcher hissed. At that monstrous metal tent. A surface car came from Rimwall West and was like a hawk into a nest of rock partridge. Our captive Sardaukar have arrived, Paul said. They've a shield around the entire landing field now, the watcher said. I can see the air dancing even to the edge of the storage yard where they kept the spice. Now they know who it is they fight, Gurney said. Let the Harkonnen beasts tremble and fret themselves that an Atreides yet lives. Paul spoke to the Fedaykin at the telescope. Watch the flagpole atop the Emperor's ship. If my flag is raised there, it will not be, Gurney said. Paul saw the puzzled frown on Stilgar's face, said, If the Emperor recognized my claim, he'll signal by restoring the Atreides flag to Arrakis. We'll use the second plan then. Move only against the Harkonnens. The Sardaukar will stand aside and let us settle the issue between ourselves. I've no experience with these off-world things, Stilgar said. I've heard of them, but it seems unlikely that... You don't need experience to know what they'll do, Gurney said. They're sending a new flag up on a little ship, the Watcher said. The flag is yellow, with a black and red circle in the center. There's a subtle piece of business, Paul said. The Chome Company flag. It's the same as the flag at the other ships, the Fedaykin guard said. I don't understand, Stilgar said. A subtle piece of business indeed, Gurney said. Had he sent up the Atreides banner, he'd have to live by what that meant. Too many observers about. He could have signaled with the Harkonnen flag on his staff, a flat declaration that'd been. But no, he sends up the Chome rag. He's telling the people up there, Gurney pointed toward space, where the prophet is. He's saying he doesn't care if it's an Atreides here or not. How long till the storm strikes the shield wall? Paul asked. Stilgar turned away, consulted one of the Fedaykin in the bowl. Presently he returned, said, Very soon, Muad'Dib, sooner than we expected. It's a great-great-grandmother of a storm, perhaps even more than you wished. It's my storm, Paul said, and saw the silent awe on the faces of the Fedaykin who heard him. Though it shook the entire world, it could not be more than I wished. Would strike the shield wall full on. Close enough to make no difference, Stilgar said. A courier crossed from the hole that led down into the basin, said, The Sardaukar and Harkonnen patrols are pulling back, Muad'Dib. They expect the storm to spill too much sand into the basin for good visibility, Stilgar said. They think we'll be in the same fix. Tell our gunners to set their sights well before visibility drops, Paul said. They must knock the nose off every one of those ships as soon as the storm has destroyed the shields. He stepped to the wall of the bowl, pulled back a fold of the camouflage cover, and looked up at the sky. The horsetail twistings of blow sand could be seen against the dark of the sky. Paul restored the cover, said, Start sending our men down, Still. Will you not go with us? Stilgar asked. I'll wait here a bit with the Fedaykin, Paul said. Stilgar gave a knowing shrug toward Gurney, moved to the hole in the rock wall, was lost in its shadows. The trigger that blasts the shield wall aside, that I leave in your hands, Gurney, Paul said. You will do it? I'll do it. Paul gestured to a Fedaykin lieutenant, said, Othim, start moving the check patrols out of the blast area. They must be out of there before the storm strikes. The man bowed, followed Stilgar. Gurney leaned to the rock slit, spoke to the man at the telescope. Keep your attention on the south wall. It'll be completely undefended until we blow it. Dispatch a Cielago with a time signal, Paul ordered. Some ground cars are moving toward the south wall, the man at the telescope said. Some are using projectile weapons. Testing. Our people are using body shields as you commanded. The ground cars have stopped. In the abrupt silence, Paul heard the wind devils playing overhead, the front of the storm. Sand began to drift down into their bowl through gaps in the cover. A burst of wind caught the cover, whipped it away. Paul motioned his Fedaykin to take shelter, crossed to the men at the communications equipment near the tunnel mouth. Gurney stayed beside him. Paul crouched over the signalman. One said, A great-great-great-grandmother of a storm, Muad'Dib. Paul glanced up at the darkening sky, said, Gurney, have the south wall observers pulled out. He had to repeat his order, shouting above the growing noise of the storm. Gurney turned to obey. Paul fastened his face filter, tightened the stillsuit hood. Gurney returned. Paul touched his shoulder, pointed to the blast trigger set into the tunnel mouth beyond the signalman. Gurney went into the tunnel, stopped there, one hand at the trigger, his gaze on Paul. We are getting no messages, the signalman beside Paul said. Much static. Paul nodded, kept his eye on the time standard dial in front of the signalman. Presently, Paul looked at Gurney, raised a hand, returned his attention to the dial. The time counter crawled around its final circuit. Now! Paul shouted and dropped his hand. Gurney depressed the blast trigger. It seemed that a full second passed before they felt the ground beneath them ripple and shake. A rumbling sound was added to the storm's roar. The Fedaykin watcher from the telescope appeared beside Paul, the telescope clutched under one arm. The shield wall is breached, Muad'Dib! He shouted. The storm is on them, and our gunners already are firing! Paul thought of the storm sweeping across the basin, the static charge within the wall of sand that destroyed every shield barrier in the enemy camp. The storm! Someone shouted. We must get into cover, Muad'Dib! Paul came to his senses, feeling the sand needles sting his exposed cheeks. We are committed, he thought. He put an arm around the signalman's shoulder, said, Leave the equipment! There's more in the tunnel! He felt himself being pulled away. Fedaykin pressed around him to protect him. They squeezed into the tunnel mouth, feeling its comparative silence, turned a corner into a small chamber with glow globes overhead and another tunnel opening beyond. Another signalman sat there at his equipment. Much static, the man said. A swirl of sand filled the air around them. Seal off this tunnel! Paul shouted. A sudden pressure of stillness showed that his command had been obeyed. Is the way down to the basin still open? Paul asked. A Fedaykin went to look, returned, said, The explosion caused a little rock to fall, but the engineers say it is still open. They're cleaning up with lace beams. Tell them to use their hands, Paul barked. There are shields active down there. They're being careful, Muad'Dib, the man said, but he turned to obey. The signalman from outside pressed past them, carrying their equipment. I told those men to leave their equipment, Paul said. Fremen do not like to abandon equipment, Muad'Dib. One of his Fedaykin chided. Men are more important than their equipment now, Paul said. We'll have more equipment than we can use soon, or have no need for any equipment. Gurney Halleck came beside him, said, I heard them say the way down is open. We're very close to the surface here, my lord, should the Harkonnens try to retaliate in kind. They're in no position to retaliate, Paul said. They're just now finding out that they have no shields and are unable to get off Arrakis. The new command post is all prepared, though, my lord, Gurney said. They've no need of me at the command post yet, Paul said. The plan would go ahead without me. We must wait for the... I'm getting a message, Muad'Dib, said the signalman at the communications equipment. The man shook his head, pressed a receiver phone against his ear. Much static! He began scribbling on a pad in front of him, shaking his head, waiting, writing, waiting. Paul crossed to the signalman's side. The Fedaykin stepped back, giving him room. He looked down at what the men had written, read, Raid on C.H. Tabor. Captives. Alia, blank. Families of, blank. Dead are, they, blank. Son of Muad'Dib. Again, the signalman shook his head. Paul looked up to see Gurney staring at him. The message is garbled, Gurney said. The static. You don't know that... My son is dead, Paul said, and knew as he spoke that it was true. My son is dead, and Alia is a captive. Hostage. He felt emptied, a shell without emotions. Everything he touched brought death and grief, and it was like a disease that could spread across the universe. He could feel the old man wisdom, the accumulation out of the experiences from countless possible lives. Something seemed to chuckle and rub its hands within him. And Paul thought, how little the universe knows about the nature of real cruelty. And there we go. That's our first chapter. So here we go with our second one. And Muad'Dib stood before them, and he said, Though we deem the captive dead, yet does she live. For her seed is my seed, and her voice is my voice. And she sees unto the farthest reaches of possibility. Yea, unto the veil of the unknowable does she see, because of me. From Arrakis Awakening, by the Princess Irulan. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen stood with eyes downcast in the Imperial audience chamber, the oval seal link within the Padishah Emperor's hutment. With covert glances, the Baron had studied the metal-walled room and its occupants. The nukers, the pages, the guards, the troop of House Sardaukar, drawn up around the walls, standing at ease there beneath the bloody and tattered captured battle flags that were the room's only decoration. Voices sounded from the right of the chamber, echoing out of a high passage. Make way! Make way for the royal person! The Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV came out of the passage into the audience chamber, followed by his suite. He stood waiting while his throne was brought, ignoring the Baron, seemingly ignoring every person in the room. The Baron found that he could not ignore the royal person, and studied the Emperor for a sign, any clue to the purpose of this audience. The Emperor stood poised, waiting, a slim, elegant figure in gray Sardaukar uniform with silver and gold trim. His thin face and cold eyes reminded the Baron of the Duke Leto, long dead. There was that same look of the predatory bird. But the Emperor's hair was red, not black, and most of that hair was concealed by a Berseg's ebon helmet with the imperial crest in gold upon its crown. Pages brought the throne. It was a massive chair carved from a single piece of Hagal quartz. Blue-green translucency shot through with streaks of yellow fire. They placed it on the dais, and the Emperor mounted, seating himself. An old woman in a black Abba robe, with hood drawn down around her forehead, detached herself from the Emperor's suite, took up station behind the throne, one scrawny hand resting on the quartz back. Her face peered out of the hood like a witch caricature. Sunken cheeks and eyes, an overlong nose, skin mottled and with protruding veins. The Baron stilled his trembling at the sight of her. The presence of the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, the Emperor's truthsayer, betrayed the importance of this audience. The Baron looked away from her, studied the suite for a clue. There were two of the guild agents, one tall and fat, one short and fat, both with bland gray eyes. And among the lackeys stood one of the Emperor's daughters, the Princess Irulan, a woman they said was being trained in the deepest of the Bene Gesserit ways, destined to be a Reverend Mother. She was tall, blonde, face of chiseled beauty, green eyes that looked past and through him. "My dear Baron," the Emperor had deigned to notice him. The voice was baritone, and with exquisite control. It managed to dismiss him while greeting him. The Baron bowed low, advanced to the required position 10 paces from the dais. "I came at your summons, Majesty." "Summons!" the old witch cackled. "Now, Reverend Mother," the Emperor chided, but he smiled at the Baron's discomfiture, said, "First, you will tell me where you sent your minion, Thufir Hawat." The Baron darted his gaze left and right, reviled himself for coming here without his own guards. Not that they'd be much use against Sardaukar. Still. "Well," the Emperor said. "He has been gone these 5 days, Majesty." The Baron shot a glance at the guild agents, back at the Emperor. "He was to land at a smuggler base and attempt infiltrating the camp of the Fremen fanatic, this Muad'Dib." "Incredible," the Emperor said. One of the witch's claw-like hands tapped the Emperor's shoulder. She leaned forward, whispered in his ear. The Emperor nodded, said, 5 days, Baron. Tell me, why aren't you worried about his absence?" "But I am worried, Majesty." The Emperor continued to stare at him, waiting. The Reverend Mother emitted a cackling laugh. "What I mean, Majesty," the Baron said, "is that Hawat will be dead within another few hours anyway." And he explained about the latent poison and need for an antidote. "How clever of you, Baron," the Emperor said. "And where are your nephews, Raban and the young Feyd-Rautha?" "The storm comes, Majesty. I sent them to inspect our perimeter, lest the Fremen attack under cover of the sand." "Perimeter," the Emperor said. The word came as though it puckered his mouth. "The storm won't be much here in the basin, and that Fremen rabble won't attack while I'm here with 5 legions of Sardaukar." "Surely not, Majesty," the Baron said. "But error on the side of caution cannot be censured." "Ah," the Emperor said. "Censure. Then I'm not to speak of how much time this Arrakis nonsense has taken from me, nor the Chome Company profits pouring down this rat hole, nor the court functions and affairs of state I've had to delay, even cancel, because of this stupid affair." The Baron lowered his gaze, frightened by the imperial anger. The delicacy of his position here, alone and dependent upon the convention and the dictum familia of the great houses, fretted him. "Does he mean to kill me?" the Baron asked himself. "He couldn't, not with the other great houses waiting up there, aching for any excuse to gain from this upset on Arrakis." Have you taken hostages? The Emperor asked.
It's useless, Majesty,
the Baron said.
These mad Fremen hold a burial ceremony for every captive, and act as though such a one were already dead.
So, the Emperor said. And the Baron waited, glancing left and right at the metal walls of the Selimlik, thinking of the monstrous fan metal tent around him. Such unlimited wealth it represented that even the Baron was awed.
He brings pages, the Baron thought, and useless court lackeys, his women and their companions, hairdressers, designers, everything. All the fringe parasites of the court, all here, fawning, slyly plotting, roughing it with the Emperor, here to watch him put an end to this affair, to make epigrams over the battles and idolize the wounded.
Perhaps you've never sought the right kind of hostages, the Emperor said.
He knows something,
the Baron thought. Fear sat like a stone in his stomach until he could hardly bear the thought of eating. Yet the feeling was like hunger, and he poised himself several times in his dispensers on the point of ordering food brought to him. But there was no one here to obey his summons. Do you have any idea who this Muad'Dib could be? The Emperor asked.
One of the Umma, surely, the Baron said. A Fremen fanatic, a religious adventurer. They crop up regularly on the fringes of civilization. Your Majesty knows this.
The Emperor glanced at his truthsayer, turned back to scowl at the Baron. And you have no other knowledge of this Muad'Dib?
A madman, the Baron said. But all Fremen are a little mad.
Mad?
His people scream his name as they leap into battle. The women throw their babies at us and hurl themselves onto our knives to open a wedge for their men to attack us. They have no decency.
As bad as that, the Emperor murmured, and his tone of derision did not escape the Baron. Tell me, my dear Baron, have you investigated the southern polar regions of Arrakis? The Baron stared up at the Emperor, shocked by the change of subject.
But, well, you know, Your Majesty, the entire region is uninhabitable, open to wind and worm. There's not even any spice in those latitudes.
You've had no reports from spice lighters that patches of greenery appear there?
There have always been such reports. Some were investigated. Long ago, a few plants were seen. Many thopters were lost, much too costly. Your Majesty, it's a place where men cannot survive for long.
So, the Emperor said. He snapped his fingers, and a door opened at the left behind the throne. Through the door came two Sardaukar, herding a girl child who appeared to be about 4 years old. She wore a black abaya, the hood thrown back to reveal the attachments of a stillsuit hanging free at her throat. Her eyes were Fremen blue, staring out of a soft, round face. She appeared completely unafraid, and there was a look to her stare that made the Baron feel uneasy, for no reason he could explain. Even the old Bene Gesserit truthsayer drew back, as the child passed and made a warning sign in her direction. The old witch obviously was shaken by the child's presence. The Emperor cleared his throat to speak, but the child spoke first. A thin voice with traces of a soft palate lisp, but clear nonetheless.
So here he is,
she said. She advanced to the edge of the dais.
He doesn't appear much, does he? One frightened old fat man, too weak to support his own flesh, without the help of suspensors.
It was such a totally unexpected statement from the mouth of a child that the Baron stared at her, speechless in spite of his anger.
Is it a widget?
He asked himself. My dear Baron, the Emperor said, become acquainted with the sister of Muad'Dib.
The sister?
The Baron shifted his attention to the Emperor.
I do not understand.
I too sometimes err on the side of caution, the Emperor said. It has been reported to me that your uninhabited South Polar regions exhibit evidence of human activity.
But that's impossible, the Baron protested. The worms, there's sand clear to the...
These people seem able to avoid the worms, the Emperor said. The child sat down on the dais beside the throne, dangled her feet over the edge, kicking them. There was such an air of sureness in the way she appraised her surroundings. The Baron stared at the kicking feet, the way they moved the black robe, the wink of sandals beneath the fabric.
Unfortunately, the Emperor said, I only sent in 5 troop carriers with a light attack force to pick up prisoners for questioning. We barely got away with 3 prisoners and 1 carrier. Mind you, Baron, my Sardaukar were almost overwhelmed by a force composed mostly of women, children, and old men. This child here was in command of one of the attacking groups. You see, Your Majesty, the Baron said. You see how they are.
I allowed myself to be captured,
the child said.
I did not want to face my brother and have to tell him that his son had been killed.
Only a handful of our men got away, the Emperor said. Got away! You hear that?
We'd have had them too,
the child said.
Except for the flames.
My Sardaukar used the attitudinal jets on their carrier as flamethrowers, the Emperor said. A move of desperation, and the only thing that got them away with their 3 prisoners. Mark that, my dear Baron. Sardaukar forced to retreat in confusion from women and children and old men. We must attack in force, the Baron rasped. We must destroy every last vestige of silence, the Emperor roared.
He pushed himself forward on his throne.
Do not abuse my intelligence any longer. You stand there in your foolish innocence and...
Majesty,
the old truthsayer said. He waved her to silence.
You say you don't know about the activity we found, nor the fighting qualities of these superb people.
The Emperor lifted himself half off his throne.
What do you take me for, Baron?
The Baron took 2 backward steps, thinking,
It was Raban. He has done this to me. Raban has...
And this fake dispute with Duke Leto, the Emperor purred, sinking back into his throne. How beautifully you maneuvered it.
Majesty, the Baron pleaded. What are you... Silence!
The old Bene Gesserit put a hand on the Emperor's shoulder, leaned close to whisper in his ear. The child seated on the dais stopped kicking her feet, said,
Make him afraid some more, Shaddam. I shouldn't enjoy this, but I find the pleasure impossible to suppress.
Quiet, child, the Emperor said. He leaned forward, put a hand on her head, stared at the Baron.
Is it possible, Baron? Could you be as simple-minded as my truthsayer suggests? Do you not recognize this child, daughter of your ally, Duke Leto?
My father was never his ally,
the child said.
My father is dead, and this old Harkonnen beast has never seen me before.
The Baron was reduced to stupefied glaring. When he found his voice, it was only to rasp,
Who?
I am Alia, daughter of Duke Leto and the Lady Jessica, sister of Duke Paul Muad'Dib,
the child said. She pulled herself off the dais, dropped to the floor of the audience chamber.
My brother has promised to have your head atop his battle standard, and I think he shall.
Be hushed, child,
the Emperor said, and he sank back into his throne, hand to chin, studying the Baron.
I do not take the Emperor's orders,
Alia said. She turned, looked up at the old Reverend Mother.
She knows.
The Emperor glanced up at his truthsayer.
What does she mean?
That child is an abomination,
the old woman said.
Her mother deserves a punishment greater than anything in history. Death! It cannot come too quickly for that child or the one who spawned her.
The old woman pointed a finger at Alia.
Get out of my mind!
TP,
the Emperor whispered. He snapped his attention back to Alia.
By the Great Mother.
You don't understand, Majesty,
the old woman said.
Not telepathy. She's in my mind. She's like the ones before me, the ones who gave me their memories. She stands in my mind. She cannot be there, but she is.
What others? The Emperor demanded. What is this nonsense?
The old woman straightened, lowered her pointing hand.
I've said too much, but the fact remains that this child, who is not a child, must be destroyed. Long were we warned against such a one, and how to prevent such a birth. But one of our own has betrayed us.
You babble, old woman,
Alia said.
You don't know how it was, yet you rattle on like a purblind fool.
Alia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and held it. The old Reverend Mother groaned and staggered. Alia opened her eyes.
That's how it was,
She said.
A cosmic accident, and you played your part in it.
The Reverend Mother held out both hands, palms pushing the air toward Alia.
What is happening here? The Emperor demanded. Child, can you truly project your thoughts into the mind of another?
That's not how it is at all,
Alia said.
Unless I'm born as you, I cannot think as you.
Kill her,
the old woman muttered, and clutched the back of the throne for support.
Kill her!
The sunken old eyes glared at Alia.
Silence,
the Emperor said, and he studied Alia.
Child, can you communicate with your brother?
My brother knows I'm here,
Alia said.
Can you tell him to surrender as the price of your life?
Alia smiled up at him with clear innocence.
I shall not do that,
she said. The Baron stumbled forward to stand beside Alia.
Majesty, he pleaded, I knew nothing of— Interrupt me once more, Baron, the Emperor said, and you will lose the powers of interruption forever.
He kept his attention focused on Alia, studying her through slitted lids.
You will not, eh? Can you read in my mind what I'll do if you disobey me?
I already said I cannot read minds,
she said.
But one doesn't need telepathy to read your intentions.
The Emperor scowled.
Child, your cause is hopeless. I have but to rally my forces and reduce this planet to—
It's not that simple,
Alia said. She looked at the two guildsmen.
Ask them.
It is not wise to go against my desires, the Emperor said. You should not deny me the least thing.
My brother comes now,
Alia said.
Even an emperor may tremble before Muad'Dib, for he has the strength of righteousness, and heaven smiles upon him.
The Emperor surged to his feet.
This play has gone far enough. I will take your brother and this planet and grind them to—
The room rumbled and shook around them. There came a sudden cascade of sand behind the throne where the hutman was coupled to the Emperor's ship. The abrupt flicker tightening of skin pressure told of a wide area shield being activated.
I told you,
Alia said.
My brother comes.
The Emperor stood in front of his throne, right hand pressed to right ear, the servo receiver there chattering its report on the situation. The Baron moved 2 steps behind Alia. Sardaukar were leaping to positions at the doors.
We will fall back into space and reform, the Emperor said. Baron, my apologies. These madmen are attacking under cover of the storm. We will show them an Emperor's wrath then.
He pointed at Alia.
Give her body to the storm.
As he spoke, Alia fled backward, feigning terror.
Let the storm have what it can take,
she screamed, and she backed into the Baron's arms.
I have her, Majesty,
the Baron shouted.
Shall I dispatch her now?
He hurled to the floor, clutched his left arm.
I'm sorry, grandfather,
Alia said.
You've met the Atreides Gom Jabbar.
She got to her feet, dropped a dark needle from her hand. The Baron fell back, his eyes bulged as he stared at a red slash on his left palm.
You...
He rolled sideways in his suspensors, a sagging mass of flesh supported inches off the floor, with head lolling and mouth hanging open.
These people are insane, the Emperor snarled. Quick, into the ship! We'll purge this planet of every—
Something sparkled to his left. A roll of ball lightning bounced away from the wall there, crackled as it touched the metal floor. The smell of burned insulation swept through the sealum link.
The shield! One of the Sardaukar officers shouted. The outer shield is down!
His words were drowned in a metallic roaring as the ship wall behind the Emperor trembled and rocked.
They shot the nose off our ship!
Someone called. Dust boiled through the room. Under its cover, Alia leaped up, ran toward the outer door. The Emperor whirled, motioned his people into an emergency door that swung open in the ship's side behind the throne. He flashed a hand signal to a Sardaukar officer leaping through the dust haze.
"We will make our stand here,"
the Emperor ordered. Another crash shook the hutment. The double doors banged open at the far side of the chamber, admitting wind-blown sand and the sound of shouting. A small, black-robed figure could be seen momentarily against the light. Alia darting out to find a knife, and, as befitting her Fremen training, to kill Harkonnen and Sardaukar wounded. House Sardaukar charged through a greened-yellow haze toward the opening, weapons ready, forming an arc there to protect the Emperor's retreat.
"Save yourself, sire!"
a Sardaukar officer shouted.
"Into the ship!"
But the Emperor stood alone now on his dais, pointing toward the doors. A 40-meter section of the hutment had been blasted away there, and the Sealmix doors opened now onto drifting sand. A dust cloud hung low over the outside world, blowing from pastel distances. Static lightning crackled from the cloud, and the spark flashes of shields being shorted out by the storm's charge could be seen through the haze. The plain surged with figures in combat, Sardaukar and leaping, gyrating robed men who seemed to come down out of the storm. All this was as a frame for the target of the Emperor's pointing hand. Out of the sand haze came an orderly mass of flashing shapes, great rising curves with crystal spokes that resolved into the gaping mouths of sandworms, a massed wall of them, each with troops of Fremen riding to the attack. They came in a hissing wedge, robes whipping in the wind as they cut through the melee on the plain. Onward toward the Emperor's hutment they came, while the House Sardaukar stood awed for the first time in their history by an onslaught their minds found difficult to accept. But the figures leaping from the wormbacks were men, and the blades flashing in that ominous yellow light were a thing the Sardaukar had been trained to face. They threw themselves into combat, and it was man to man on the plain of Arrakeen, while a picked Sardaukar bodyguard pressed the Emperor back into the ship, sealed the door on him, and prepared to die at the door as part of his shield. In the shock of comparative silence within the ship, the Emperor stared at the wide-eyed faces of his suite, seeing his oldest daughter with a flush of exertion on her cheeks, the old truthsayer standing like a black shadow with her hood pulled about her face, finding at last the faces he sought, the two guildsmen. They wore the guild gray, unadorned, and seemed to fit the calm they maintained despite the high emotions around them. The taller of the two, though, held a hand to his left eye. As the Emperor watched, someone jostled the guildsman's arm, the hand moved, and the eye was revealed. The man had lost one of his masking contact lenses, and the eye stared out a total blue so dark as to be almost black. The smaller of the pair elbowed his way a step nearer the Emperor, said, "We cannot know how it will go." And the taller companion, hand restored to eye, added in a cold voice, "But this Muad'Dib cannot know either." The word shocked the Emperor out of his daze. He checked the scorn on his tongue by a visible effort, because he did not take a guild navigator's single-minded focus on the main chance to see the immediate future out on that plain. Were these two so despondent upon their faculty that they had lost the use of their eyes and their reason? He wondered.
"Reverend Mother," he said, "we must devise a plan."
She pulled the hood from her face, met his gaze with an unblinking stare. The look that passed between them carried complete understanding. They had one weapon left, and they both knew it. Treachery. "Summon Count Fenring from his quarters," the Reverend Mother said. The Padishah Emperor nodded, waved for one of his aides to obey that command. And there we go. Those are our chapters for today. And tomorrow, we wrap it up, and we see how it all turns out. So I hope everyone enjoyed. I hope everyone has enjoyed this whole experience so far. And we'll see how everything turns out tomorrow. So, everyone have a good evening. Stay safe. Good night, everyone.